Good day. Today is Sunday, 30th March 2025, and the diplomacy surrounding the conflict in Ukraine continues at a much slower pace than before, even as we're getting more and more indications that the situation on the battlefields is beginning to intensify, perhaps with the end of the spring thaw, and with information that we're approaching the time, maybe in May, when the Russians will launch their major offensive. Let's just do a quick overview about the diplomatic situation. Now, Grigory Karasin, who is Russia's representative in the expert talks which have been taking place with the United States, the man who met with the Americans in Riyadh last week. Anyway, he's now come out and made a statement. He's given an interview in which he said that it might be wrong to expect a ceasefire this year. He said it might be possible to have the ceasefire by the end of the year, but nobody can be certain when the ceasefire will be agreed by. And obviously there remains a great deal still to do. He said this in an interview today, which he gave to Russian television. He said that the ceasefire may not come this year or at the end of this year. It would be naive to expect any breakthrough results at the very first meeting. So I think this is realistic. I think the idea that we're going to get a ceasefire sorted out within just a few weeks or a few days, that we could see a ceasefire agreed by the 20th of April. Given the enormous complexities of this conflict, is to expect altogether too much. It does not recognise the realities of the complexity of conflict settlement. I've never been directly involved in conflict settlement myself, but I have seen how conflicts end many times in my life, and it's invariably the case that ceasefires which are not worked through properly with proper monitoring institutions, monitors and people to look into them, and ceasefires, by the way, to which both sides are not equally committed, have a habit of breaking down almost immediately. And perhaps, given the damage that can do to mutual confidence and trust, it's probably better not to try and set up ceasefires in that kind of hurry at all. Now, I ought to say, when I said that ceasefires have a habit of breaking down almost immediately, that appears to be the case, at least if you believe the Russians, in connection with the 30-day ceasefire on attacks on energy systems. At least the Russians are claiming that over the last 36 hours, Ukrainian attacks on the Russian energy system have, if anything, intensified. There was a major drone attack on energy facilities, pipelines, gas stations, that kind of thing, in Belgorod and Kursk region. At one point, 9,000 people in Belgorod region, according to the Russians, were left without power, though apparently that has now all been restored. And the Russian Defense Ministry makes a careful record of each ceasefire violation. And I can't help but think that this is all being prepared to be presented to the Americans and, of course, to the Ukrainians when, whatever time, the discussions about setting up the ceasefires resume. Now, all of this, of course, is leading to criticism within Russia. The Russians, some people in Russia are saying, why does Russia comply with this 30-day ceasefire when the Ukrainians are not complying with it? Shouldn't Russia do what the provisions of the ceasefire already say, which is that if one side is not observing it, the other side is under no obligation to do the same. Shouldn't the Russians simply walk away from this ceasefire and immediately begin launching their own attacks on the Ukrainian energy system? Well, I think that the Russians are not going to do that. I think they're going to wait until the end of the 30 days, which will be sometime in mid-April. And the reason they are not going to do that, in my opinion, are severalfold. Firstly, according to the Russians, the suggestion for this ceasefire was Donald Trump's initiative. He discussed it with Vladimir Putin over the phone when they spoke on the 18th of March. Putin agreed with it then. I think that the Russians would be very, very unwilling to upset and embarrass Trump by saying straightforwardly that the 30-day ceasefire that Putin committed himself to has already broken down and that Russia will not comply with it any further. I think the Russians feel that, for the moment at least, the damage the Ukrainians are doing is absorbable, is minimal, and that the Russians can afford to accept this damage, and there's no reason to upset and embarrass and perhaps antagonize Donald Trump by pulling out of the ceasefire prematurely. The second reason is what I come back to before, which is that I don't actually think that the Russians have compromised fundamentally on their military preparations by agreeing to the ceasefire. As Alex Christoforou and I discussed on the Duran, and as I've already pointed out in programs on this channel, if you look at the big Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, the ones that are carried out with the missiles, the air-launched missiles and the sea-launched missiles and the ballistic missiles, and with the hundreds of drones and all of that, the Russians tend to carry out these attacks on a periodic basis, usually at intervals of around 30 days. Sometimes they've conducted double taps. They've conducted one attack on one day and then they followed it up with a second attack on the following day. And that has happened. But more often than not, the Russians wait around 30 days, see what the Ukrainians are doing, and then attack again. And that has been the pattern, and I see no reason why the Russians would want to break it. Now, a couple of days before Putin and Trump spoke, a missile attack by the Russians was indeed carried out against the Ukrainian energy system. And for that reason, the Russians probably feel that they're not going to compromise or lose anything by complying with the 30-day ceasefire until they're ready for the next attack, which would probably be in around 30 days from the time when the ceasefire was agreed. So this is a second reason why I think the Russians will not rush to break the ceasefire. The third reason is that, of course, these attacks by the Ukrainians upon the Russian energy system are precisely intended to provoke a Russian response, to have the Russians, as the Ukrainians would say, break the ceasefire, attack Ukrainian energy installations. The Ukrainians would then say that it was the Russians who were violating the ceasefire. The Western media, the mighty Wurlitzer, as a CIA agent of the 1960s once referred to it as, would then, of course, amplify and repeat that claim. And, well, in that case, the ceasefire would have been, the appearance would be that the ceasefire had been broken by the Russians. That's the story that would be spun. Many people probably, who are not familiar with the detail, would believe it, and the Ukrainians would have gained at least a media advantage, which is not to be completely discounted in terms of the manoeuvring that is going on at the present time. So I think it makes more sense for the Russians to see this thing through, the 30 days through, and then when the 30 days are over, assuming the Ukrainian attacks continue, they can say that the ceasefire has not worked. They complied with it, but the Ukrainians didn't, and in light of that, they're not going to be bound by it any further. They're not going to agree to roll it over again. And that, it seems to me, makes much more sense. It doesn't embarrass Trump to the same extent. Putin can say that he has not broken any agreements or promises he made to Trump. And, of course, the Ukrainians will still say that it's the Russians who are not keen on a ceasefire. But the Russians can come back and say, well, we gave it 30 days, which is what we agreed to do. It didn't work during that time. And therefore, we are obliged to return to the attack. And that will be, I suspect, an easier story to manage, an easier argument to make. Now, the European Union is helping the Russians in this regard because they have now come out clearly against the attempt by the United States, by Donald Trump, to revive the Black Sea Initiative. And here perhaps it's important to stress that this was Trump's idea. It was not Putin. If you go back to the Russian readout of the 18th of March 2025 of the conversation between Putin and Trump, which took place on that day, you can see very clearly that the Russians are saying that it was Trump who proposed the revival of the Black Sea Initiative, and Putin agreed to try. So the European Union has now made categorical statements that they're not going to give the sanctions relief to the Russian Agricultural Bank. They're not going to let the Russian Agricultural Bank be reconnected to the SWIFT payment system, messaging and payment system. They're not going to lift sanctions on Russian agricultural exports. They're not going to do any of those things. And the person who has said this, and who has said this in the most emphatic terms, is none other than Ursula von der Leyen herself. She's actually come out and said that the European Union will not lift in sanctions. Sanctions will remain in effect until a just and lasting peace is established in Ukraine. When the war is over, the sanctions might be removed. And Scholz, who's still nominally the Chancellor, has gone forward and said that sanctions relief would be a grave mistake, which makes no sense without a ceasefire first. Of course, the Black Sea Initiative is supposed to be a kind of ceasefire, but anyway, that is what Scholz is saying. And anyway, that's the position. The Europeans have said that they won't agree, and in fact, at the moment, they're pressing forward with their 17th package of sanctions. They're now preparing a 17th package of sanctions against Russia. We've had 16 packages of sanctions, but there's nothing like doing again and again and again the same thing and expecting a different result. It's been tried 16 times, so why not try a 17th time, even though nobody any longer takes seriously these sanctions packages. Each one has less effect than the one that preceded it, just to say. Anyway, that's the European Union, and of course the Russians have seized on this. I am sure that they expected all along that that would be the European reaction, and they've countered. Peskov has been talking about this. This is Putin's spokesman. He told reporters that an integral part of the Black Sea deal is the lifting of sanctions on a Russian bank. If European countries don't want to go down this path, it means they don't want to go down the path of peace in unison with the efforts shown in Moscow and Washington. And, well, I have to say, I would have been staggered if the Europeans had agreed to lift the sanctions. But, of course, the way they've done it, their absolute flat refusal to do it, at this point helps the Russians, because they can tell the Americans, and importantly, they can tell their friends in the global south, the people who are so keen on receiving food and fertilizer from Russia. Russia is now one of the world's greatest exporters of food and fertilizer. They can point out to these countries, well, look, we're happy to allow Ukrainian food to be exported from Ukraine. We obviously are very keen to export our food to you as well. The people who are creating the problems, the people who are being unhelpful, are the Europeans. The Europeans are putting restrictions, or are trying to put restrictions on the food, the export to you of the food that you need in order to keep your people from hunger. Now, I say that, I put that in a rather dramatic way. The reality actually is that just as Ukrainian food exports have not been subject to interference by the Russians at any time during the entire period of the special military operation, Russian food exports, which were affected to a certain degree back in 2022, now are as unrestricted as ever. The Europeans correctly say that there's no actual sanctions, no specific sanctions on the exports of Russian food, but of course there are significant sanctions on ships and banking systems and things of that kind, which are used to export Russian food products. So it's true that the food isn't restricted, but if you want to pay for your food, for this food, to the Russians in dollars, you can't access their banks, because most of them now, nearly all of them, all the big ones, are cut off from SWIFT. All of the ones which, as far as I'm aware, deal with the export trade, that deal with international business, are cut off from SWIFT. And the ships that carry the foodstuffs are also affected by insurance costs, and Russian ports are sanctioned as well. And the ships sometimes are also sanctioned, which can mean that they don't get repairs in ports, certainly not European ports, where they could be repaired in the natural course of things. And of course, right back in 2022, there was a substantial amount of fertilizer from Russia, which was caught as a result of the imposition of sanctions on the territory of the European Union. One of the original parts of the 2022 grain deal was that fertiliser should be released for onward sale. To my knowledge, it never has been. Perhaps the Europeans have simply confiscated it and used it for themselves. I have no idea. But by now the Russians have no doubt produced lots of fertiliser, more fertiliser to replace that which was seized on European territory. Belarus the same. They've, in other words, replaced the fertiliser that was seized. And though there are problems with their ships and their exports, the fact is that they are now able to export their food. They're able to do it. They've found all kinds of means to insure their ships. Problems of ship repair have been circumvented and ways round have been found. And more importantly, far more importantly, the fact that it has become difficult to pay the Russians in dollars and euros for their food exports. Well, what has been happening is that increasingly countries that import food from Russia are having to find other means to pay the Russians, and that can be through barter systems, and it can also be through alternative currencies, through national currencies, by buying rubles, which ruble has been appreciating, by the way, quite significantly in the last few weeks, by buying rubles, by paying the Russians in other currencies, rupees, for example, in the case of India, whatever, all of which, of course, works to the agenda of the BRIC states, of which Russia is one. These countries needing and wanting to move gradually away from dependence on Western currencies in their international trade. It is strange that though the Americans are now becoming very concerned about these developments, there are considerable discussions and commentaries about this in the American media now. And it is known that the Trump administration is very worried about this, as is Donald Trump himself, and as is apparently the new administration's Treasury team. The Europeans are blind to this. They apparently don't see the significance of this at all, even though, of course, the euro, though it has had an international role as a reserve currency, has never been able to replace or seriously challenge the dollar. But anyway, there it is. So the Europeans, once again, taking the stand that they have sabotaged the Black Sea Initiative. It's clear that this is their policy now. The Americans perhaps might start applying pressure on the Europeans to change it, but I wonder whether Donald Trump and his people will think it is worth their while. Putting pressure on the Europeans in that kind of way, direct pressure on the Europeans, would harvest negative headlines. It would reinforce the narrative that Russia and America are in some kind of alliance against Europe with each other. And ultimately, does the Black Sea Initiative matter that much? It doesn't change fundamentally the situation. Ukraine is able to export its food. Russia is able to export its food. The Black Sea remains an area of conflict. Obviously, if you see the Black Sea Initiative as a step towards agreeing a full ceasefire, then the fact that you cannot even get the Black Sea Initiative off the ground and going is a blow. But ultimately, isn't the United States perhaps already investing too much time and effort in all of this? Doesn't it have other things to think and concern itself with? After all, as Donald Trump himself pointed out some weeks ago, the United States is far removed from the area of the conflict. It's a whole continent and an ocean away. It's trying to end the conflict as quickly as it can. If the Europeans, on whose continent this war is being fought, won't even support a ceasefire in the Black Sea, why should the Americans continue to pull the coals out of the fire for the Europeans? It's not as if the United States is not preparing economic action against the Europeans, which already is going to make the position of the Europeans worse. Apparently tomorrow, or at least maybe over the course of this coming week, the United States intends to impose substantial sanctions on the European Union. Donald Trump is talking about Liberation Day. Already, from his point of view, this is having an effect, a positive effect, in terms of trade dynamics, in the sense that more and more European industrial companies are transferring their production to the continental United States itself. I've read a fascinating article recently discussing AI and chips manufacturing, which has, I think, correctly pointed out that getting foreign companies to transfer their production to the United States does not, in the end, facilitate a genuine process of reindustrialization in the United States. It creates a mirage of reindustrialization rather than the reality of it. But is Donald Trump really thinking that far ahead? Is he concerned so far in the future? If German car manufacturers step up their production of German cars in factories located in the United States, as they're apparently able and willing to do, even as they gradually reduce their production in Germany, is that something that, is it really going to be a matter of immediate concern to him, that might mean that the United States' own domestic, indigenous car industry is not going to revive as quickly as he would like? I doubt that he, at the moment, is thinking very much or is especially concerned about that. Just saying. Now, there we go. Doesn't look like we're going to get the Black Sea Initiative. Karasin says we're not going to get a ceasefire. He doesn't appear to think we're going to get a ceasefire this year or before the end of this year. And I think this is right. Now, there continues to be rhetoric right across Europe that the Russians are dragging their feet on a ceasefire. Trump has even lent some credence to that. He repeated this as well. The Ukrainians accepted an unconditional ceasefire. The Russians supposedly have not. As I've discussed previously, unconditional ceasefires always break down. The idea that you can have an immediate unconditional ceasefire makes absolutely no sense. The various conditions that Putin insisted upon, not maybe his conditions about ending military supplies to Ukraine, ending intelligence sharing to Ukraine. I can imagine that the United States might balk at that. And there is an intellectual case to be made for saying that a ceasefire that does not contain those provisions could still be a ceasefire. But all of Putin's other points about monitoring the ceasefire, making sure that violations of the ceasefire are tracked and supervised properly, and that this is done through an agency, an impartial agency in which all parties have trust. All of this surely is these are valid and serious points. It's absurd to argue and pretend that these can simply be disregarded. Anyway, we see the stance that the Europeans are taking. We see the stance that the Ukrainians are taking. They're already violating the one ceasefire that is in effect, and the Europeans have basically scotched the other ceasefire that was being talked about. Now, having said all of these things, I think it's fair to say that, of course, the Ukrainians themselves are giving their own account about what's happening over the course of the 30-day ceasefire. Firstly, they have claimed that some of the attacks on the Russian energy system are not by them, that these are Russian false flag attacks. I don't take that claim seriously. There is no evidence to support it. The Ukrainians have repeatedly made all kinds of similar claims in the past. I can remember how for years, for example, they were claiming that the murders of Donbass militia officials, leaders and officials, were the work of internecine quarrels within the militias, even as the reality was, as the Ukrainians now acknowledge, that they were murdering them themselves. So I don't take any of the claims that these are false flag attacks by the Russians seriously, and I want to make that absolutely clear. But that is what the Ukrainians are saying about some of these attacks, and you can accept them if you wish. What the Ukrainians are also bitterly complaining about is that the Russians are conducting lots of drone and missile attacks on targets right across Ukraine, including, as they say, residential targets. And there is no doubt at all that the Russians are indeed carrying out many attacks on targets across Ukraine. But as far as I can see, the targets the Russians have been attacking are not covered by the ceasefire. They're not energy installations of the sort that were agreed by the Americans and the Russians over the course of their meeting in Riyadh last week. So again, I'm afraid I don't take this complaint seriously. Again, I can understand why the Ukrainians talk about this, but one isn't really comparing like with like. I mean, these are not ceasefire violations on the Russian side. You may think that these attacks are in principle wrong, that they violate morality and ethics and all that, and that's your right, but they are not ceasefire violations. Now, having said that, there's been some recrimination in Ukraine about the way in which the negotiations have been conducted up to now. A former Ukrainian official, a former Ukrainian ambassador, I believe, has come out and said that the United States and Ukraine were completely outmaneuvered by the Russians in the Riyadh discussions. None of the items that the Ukrainians wanted included the ports, the other infrastructure, the railways in the ceasefire, the Black Sea ceasefire, were in fact included. And clearly, this person thinks that the Ukrainians and the Americans are being out-negotiated by the Russians. And I think that is true. I pointed out previously that the negotiating teams, the American negotiating team is not experienced in conducting negotiations with the Russians, with a superpower like the Russians, with the enormous institutional structures and the depth of diplomatic and negotiating experience that the Russians undoubtedly have. But having said that, whilst one can understand the criticism, was it ever likely that the Russians would agree to the kind of proposals that the Ukrainians were insisting on? Would that not, in fact, had the Ukrainians persisted in those claims, would that not have simply caused the talks to collapse without any movement at all? I think the Americans on this point were absolutely right. They went for the minimum of what could be agreed. As I said, neither side actually, in terms of the Black Sea Initiative, has conceded anything fundamental. And a ceasefire in terms of attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, or energy systems, benefits Ukraine because Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system are so much more devastating. Anyway, the fact is, the Ukrainians are not happy. There's more and more criticism of Zelensky. There's more and more criticism of the government, of the way the government is conducting matters in Ukraine. And in the meantime, clearly, what we see is that all of the attempts by the Trump administration to push forward with ceasefires are getting bogged down in the sand. The Russians want a ceasefire fully worked out and are demanding concessions that the Europeans and the Ukrainians will never agree to. The Europeans are digging in. The Ukrainians are also digging in. We're not yet at a point where a ceasefire can work. In my opinion, Professor Mearsheimer, with whom Glenn Deason and myself did another interview on Friday, has got this absolutely right. These proposals for a ceasefire, which the Americans have been making, are premature. Ukraine has not yet been brought to that point where it feels desperate, or where the Europeans feel desperate. So they're not prepared to agree to the concessions that the Russians are going to insist on in terms of any ceasefire that the Russians on their side might agree to. We are simply not close to that point yet. If the Russians do launch a major offensive in May, as I am sure they will, and if that offensive is successful, which I am sure it will also be, and if that offensive leads to the Russians, say, reaching the Dnieper, or perhaps closing in on the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and who knows, maybe Kharkov and Sumy as well, then at that point, minds in Kiev and Brussels and other European capitals might become concentrated. And at that point, just possibly, a ceasefire might be something that the Europeans and the Ukrainians agree to, because they feel they have no choice, and cannot come up with any proposal for anything else. Even then, by the way, I'm far from certain that we will get a ceasefire if, of course, the Ukrainian military simply collapses in the face of this Russian offensive. Well, there will be people in Moscow who will say, why are we agreeing a ceasefire if we can simply dictate terms. But I'm not going to examine or discuss the Russian perspectives in this program. One of the problems that Trump has experienced since he became president is that this enormously long and prolonged offensive that the Russians launched starting in October 2023, when they first began their offensive on Avdiivka, this offensive that continued right through 2024, and then right through January 2025 and into February 2025. From about February 2025, it began to slow down. And of course, this was not because the Russians have run out of steam, or because they've exhausted their resources, or because their army is weakened, or because their losses are so high that they can't keep on fighting, or because their economy is on the brink of collapse, or any of these other things. It is that after a whole year, more than a year, of continuous advance, the Russians needed to redeploy their forces, reorganize, reinforce, redeploy their forces. And also the weather conditions for further advances, with mild weather in February, unseasonably mild weather in February, and the thaw in March made big further advances more difficult. Notwithstanding which, and this is a point I made already in several programs, the Russians have continued to advance throughout February and March, and not perhaps at the same pace, whirlwind pace, as we saw, for example, in the summer and autumn of 2024, but steadily nonetheless. And unfortunately, that has again given the stalemate narrative some new life. And I'm afraid that some people in Washington especially, but also in Europe and in Britain, have believed it. They've also accepted the narrative about Russia's economy being on the skids. They've seen the fact that the Russian central bank increased interest rates to 21%, and they've seized on that fact to say that the situation within the Russian economy must be very bad and even catastrophic. And this has taken away, that has reduced some of that sense of panic and fear and urgency that we saw repeatedly recur over the course of 2024. Of course, when we saw that happen in 2024, the result was hysteria and demands for further escalation. The ebbing of the panic has, however, led to complacency, to people saying, well, why should we make big concessions now? Maybe the Russians will fold to Trump's demands and agree to the ceasefire. And anyway, there's no reason for us to make concessions because it will all turn out right somehow in the end. Well, there it is. That's where we are with the diplomacy at the moment. My own guess is that in May, after May, over the course of the summer, as things start to heat up again, as the Russians renew their offensive, as it becomes clear that, Ukrainian drones are not enough to slow or stop the Russians or anything of that kind, we will probably start to see the panic and the hysteria and the anger come back. Then maybe, just possibly, people will start to look more favourably at the idea of a ceasefire. Though my own guess is that some people, at least, Macron, for example, will probably, on the contrary, again demand further escalation and perhaps the deployment of European troops to Ukraine, not as peacekeepers, but so as to fill out the gaps and to hold back the Russians. Anyway, that now brings me to the military situation, and I gave an overview of the military situation yesterday. And by the way, since yesterday, there's been quite a lot of further news. There's been more reports that the Russians have been gradually clearing the village of Guevo in Kursk region. I have received a harrowing report about the disaster, the scale of the disaster that the Ukrainian army suffered in Guevo. It comes from Russian sources, and it gives estimates of casualties on both sides, which I'm not going to repeat in this program, if only because if I did, I have a feeling it might identify the source. All I would say is that Ukrainian casualties were roughly 4 times, at least 4 times greater than Russian ones. And there's been an absolutely devastating picture in terms of the amount of damage done to Ukraine's armoured vehicle fleet, its artilleries, its trucks and things of that kind. The Russians did, of course, suffer substantial losses in equipment as well. But as this source pointed out to me, and I've made this point myself many times, in fact you can find information about it in open sources, the Russians have a very well organized system of collecting armored vehicles that have been hit by FPV drones or other drones across the battlefronts and taking them back to vehicle repair plants. Apparently there's around 150 of them across the entire contact line. There's mechanics and engineers located there, and mostly the vast majority of these vehicles, over 80%, some say 90%, can be repaired very, very quickly, within days, and returned to battle. The explosive charge carried by an FPV drone is very small. Even if an FPV drone, this particular source says this, even if an FPV drone is actually able to enter inside the vehicle and detonate there, it will kill the crew, but it will not destroy the vehicle. It could disable it, but not beyond repair. So the Russians, despite all of these claims about the enormous amounts of equipment that they're supposedly losing, despite all the film one sees of equipment being lost all across the battlefronts, film that the Ukrainians often provide, and as I've said already, it's difficult to assess this this film properly because obviously the Ukrainians are only showing us their successes, just to say. But anyway, even there, in many cases, the film that one sees about vehicles being hit and set on fire and that kind of thing, doesn't mean that those vehicles cannot be brought back into battle. The Russian repair crews, in most cases, reach these vehicles. After all, it's the Russians who are advancing, and they're taken back to these centers, and they're repaired there, and they're brought back into service, and they're brought back into service, in most cases, very fast. I should say that very often what you see in films, and by the way, around 80% of the films of drone attacks that one sees coming from the war are provided by Ukraine. The Russians do provide their own drone footage, but it is on a much, much more limited scale. Despite the fact that, as we will see, they have many, many more drones than the Ukrainians do. But anyway, in many, many cases, what we see are Ukrainian drones striking and destroying empty Russian armoured vehicles which have unloaded their crews, the section of infantry that they carry, and the other crew members, because they've just reached the battle line and are about to engage the Ukrainians and fight them. So quite often you see these armoured vehicles on the roads, and then the Ukrainians strike at these armoured vehicles, and you see the fires, and many people think that these vehicles are therefore knocked out. But as I said, if the Russians retain the ground and capture it or advance further, then their repair crews are on the scene within hours, and the vehicles are taken back to the repair plants and they're brought back into service. And in Kursk region, it was even worse, because not only did the Russians retrieve nearly all of the vehicles, the armoured vehicles that they lost, quite a lot of civilian vehicles were also destroyed. And here I think there will have been less interest in repairing them. But anyway, not only did the Russians retrieve most of the armoured vehicles that they lost and bring them back to repair, but the Ukrainians abandoned large numbers of their own armoured vehicles. And the result is that the Russians have been able to capture a significant number of these, and some of them they've also been able to repair and press into service. So we might start to see Russian units using sometimes Western armoured vehicles supplied to Russia by Ukraine. Just say. Now, anyway, the picture of the devastation of the Ukrainian force in Kursk is incredibly grim. And if these figures are correct, and again, I'm not going to provide these figures, but certainly the losses exceed those of Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive of 2023, just to say, by a significant margin. Now, it's not just Kursk where the fighting is going on. As I said, Guyevo, where the Ukrainians are still holding out, is apparently now mostly under Russian control. The Ukrainians are holding out in two other villages. I said one in my program yesterday, but nobody expects them to be able to hold out there for much longer. And the Russians continue, by the way, to expand their foothold in their bridgehead in Sumy region. Apti Alaudinov, the head of the Akhmat Special Forces Brigade of the Russian military, says that the mission that the Russian troops in Sumy region are currently executing is to establish a strong bridgehead within Sumy region in preparation for further, deeper advances. Now that might bear out Zelensky's concerns that the Russians have plans for a big offensive in Sumy region in the spring and summer. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, there's been other news from other parts of the battlefronts. There's been reports that the Russian advance in the Oskol River area has been accelerating markedly. In fact, there's talk that the entire Ukrainian defense along the Oskol is collapsing. information is very, very sketchy, and I'm not going to discuss it further in today's program. There's also reports, and these I believe, that the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack in Chasiv Yar. Marochko, one of our standard sources, told TASS a couple of days ago that the Russians control 85% of Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is on a height. It is essential for the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians from fully capturing Chasiv Yar, because if the Russians do so, the Russians will be in a position very quickly to capture Konstantinovka as well. So the Ukrainians apparently have been redeploying troops from Kursk region, exhausted, demoralized, no doubt, and broken up troops from Kursk region to the Chasiv Yar, Toretsk area, in order to try to not just hold back the Russians, but to regain some of the ground that they've lost around Chasiv Yar. Just like the Ukrainian counterattacks in Toretsk, these counterattacks in Chasiv Yar will fail. They are simply going to lead to more attrition of the Ukrainian troops. Is going to weaken their positions in general even further. And I noticed that the founder of the Azov Brigade, Belitsky, has actually now come out and said that he thinks that the Russian strategy over the course of 2025 will be less to achieve dramatic breakthroughs than to intensify aggressive attrition, to grind the Ukrainians down still further, to exhaust them still more. He may be right. I personally think that the Russians do intend something more ambitious. After all, Putin is talking about this. So I think that we will probably see significant Russian advances. And I suspect that what Belitsky is really concerned about is precisely that the Ukrainians are continuing to fritter away their manpower and their equipment. The equipment that they received from the Americans and from the Turks, ultimately from Syria, over the course of the winter, in these pointless counterattacks in places like Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, which ultimately undermine their position. But anyway, even as all of that is going on, there's been dramatic news, more dramatic news from the South Donbass, Donetsk direction. The Russians appear to have made further very, very significant advances. This morning, the Russian Defense Ministry said that a village called Zaporozhye, which, by the way, is not to be confused with the city, the great city of Zaporozhye, which is on the Dnieper, but the village of Zaporozhye has now been captured by the Russians, together with the village of Preobrazhenka. These are very close to the border with Dnipro region. The Russians also appear to be in the process of capturing another important village in this area, which is called Rozlev. It looks as if the Russians are coming closer to the point of destroying, breaking the Ukrainian Khortytsa group in southwest Donbass, opening up the way for them to advance to the Dnieper, to where Zaporozhye, the great city of Zaporozhye, and the city of Dnipro are situated. So anyway, we've had more news of that kind. We've had more news, by the way, of Russian missile attacks across Ukraine. And as I said, for the moment at least, the negotiations seem to be frozen. Now, in the space caused by the stopping of the negotiations, or at least the pause in the negotiations. Other things are going on. The United States, the US government, continues to express or make clear its intense interest in Greenland. Vice President Vance has recently visited Greenland. There's been all kinds of claims and ridicule, at least in the European media, of his trip there. President Trump has made statements about Greenland. He's made it clear that he believes that Greenland will indeed one day be part of the United States. He's also said that he believes that this will probably be achieved peacefully, but he doesn't seem to be ruling out military use of force to bring Greenland under American control, to bring Greenland into the United States. Now, Putin, over the course of his trip to Murmansk, made certain comments about Greenland, which some people, somewhat incredibly, are treating as a green light to the Americans to just go ahead and annex Greenland. I have to say, I found this absolutely bizarre. I remember reading these comments, and I found it most strange that people would think that Putin was actually giving a green light to the Americans to seize Greenland. As far as I could see, what he was doing, or rather what he was saying, was that this is not our business. We are not in any position to do anything about this. This is a matter between the Americans and the Danes, and we're going to stay out. He did do that which he often does, which is that he engaged in something of a historical, shall I say, discussion of the Greenland affair. Saying, this is the background, this is the history, this is it goes all the way back to the 1860s when the Americans first began to show an interest in Greenland, and they were interested in Greenland in 1910, and then they defended Greenland. They established themselves in Greenland during the Second World War, and all of these things. If you follow Putin, if you read his speeches as often as I do, you will know that this is exactly the kind of thing he does. Putin is somebody who is fascinated by history. Clearly, it is his favourite subject. It's the subject that he likes most to read about. And, well, he obviously familiarised himself with the story about Greenland, and he likes to lecture people about these things. But I don't think anybody should take his words here at all seriously. I can't understand. When I read them, I simply couldn't understand why people did take them as seriously as people do. Certainly, I don't treat Putin's words on this topic as Putin endorsing Trump's attempt to take over Greenland or anything of that kind. I'll just read them, actually. I've just found them. He says, suffice it to say about the plans of the United States to annex Greenland. You know, it can surprise someone only at first glance. It is a profound mistake to treat it as some preposterous talk by the new administration. Nothing of the sort. In fact, the United States had such plans as far back as the 1860s. As early as that, the US administration was considering possible annexation of Greenland and Iceland. However, the idea did not enjoy support in Congress then. Let me remind you, by the way, that by 1868, the purchase of Alaska from Russia was ridiculed in the American press. It was called madness, an icebox, and President Andrew Johnson's polar bear garden. Therefore, the Greenland proposal failed. But that acquisition, the purchase of Alaska, is probably viewed very differently in the United States today, just as President Johnson's actions are. Thus, what is happening today is not really surprising, particularly since the story only began back then, and it went on and on. In 1910, for example, a trilateral land swap deal was negotiated between the United States, Germany, and Denmark. As a result, Greenland would have gone to the United States, but the deal fell through. And then during World War II, the United States stationed military bases in Greenland to protect it from Nazi takeover. After the war, the United States suggested Denmark should sell the island. This was quite recently in terms of world history. In short, the United States has serious plans regarding Greenland. These plans have long historical roots, as I have mentioned, and it is obvious that the United States will continue to advance consistently its geostrategic, military, political, and economic interests in the Arctic. It is absolutely typical Putin. It doesn't imply endorsement of Trump or anything of that kind. I'm amazed, as I said, that people have spun it that way. I read article after article, especially in the British media, in The Guardian, The Times, all sorts of places, implying and insinuating this, and it is nonsense. Anyway, more seriously, there is now a increasingly long line of world leaders who apparently intend to come to Moscow for the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Second World War. Xi Jinping will be there. The Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam will be there. Lula, the President of Brazil, will be there. And there are reports that Prime Minister Modi might also be there, though this is disputed. But it is confirmed, apparently, that arrangements for Putin's trip to India are now well advanced, and Putin could be traveling to India very, very soon. So this narrative about Russia being isolated and all of that, we still see, it's extraordinary to my mind that people insist on it when we see so much evidence that this is not the case at all. And even as Lula is apparently intending to travel to Moscow to meet with Putin, his good friend, and to attend the celebrations of Victory Day in Moscow, Victory Day over Nazi Germany. Lula has apparently refused to meet an emissary, an envoy, sent to him by President Zelensky. This was a former Prime Minister of Italy. Zelensky asked him to apparently travel on Ukraine's behalf to various BRICS states and other states. It surprises me that Zelensky decided not to send a Ukrainian official or diplomat. Maybe Zelensky has come to understand that even these people do not do their job very well, and maybe he thinks that a former Italian prime minister might be somehow more emollient, or it could be that he thinks that there's a very large Italian population in Brazil, which there is, expatriate population, or at least Brazilians of Italian extraction, and that might make a visit by an Italian politician or former politician on Ukraine's behalf more acceptable to Lula. Anyway, the key thing to say is that Lula refused to meet with this person. He apparently said that as far as he was concerned, the entire negotiations to settle the conflict in Ukraine are now a matter for the Americans and the Russians, and that Brazil is not prepared to participate or to become involved. So this was a slamming of the door in Zelensky's face. Now, it's worth saying here that Lula and Zelensky do not get on. There was an incident that happened, I think it was about a year ago, at the G7 meeting from memory, I think it was Tokyo. Lula was there, and Zelensky came along, and Zelensky wanted to meet with Lula, and he wanted to meet with Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. And neither Modi nor Lula were particularly anxious to meet Zelensky, but they eventually agreed. And Zelensky did meet with Modi, and I discussed at the time, I remember, the Indian readout, and it was clear that the conversation between Zelensky and Modi did not go well at all. And then Zelensky was supposed to meet with Lula, who obviously had given up part of his time for this meeting with Zelensky, except that Zelensky didn't show up. He gave an excuse and he didn't appear. I suspect that he was upset and angry after his meeting with Modi, and he didn't want to go through that all over again with Lula. Anyway, unsurprisingly, Lula was very offended. I remember that there were comments and observations about this at the time. And I don't think that Lula, who is the president of a major country, Brazil, country of hundreds of millions of people, a potential and actual economic and cultural powerhouse, by far the biggest country in Latin America. Anyway, Lula was apparently furious, and he has never forgiven Zelensky for what happened. So, just saying. Now, so Zelensky's diplomatic initiatives outside, beyond his European friends, not going at all well. This is a point, by the way, that my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has made many, many times. European leaders, people like Starmer, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Scholz, never seem to grasp the fact that outside Europe, outside this ring of intensely hostile to Russia European countries, Zelensky simply doesn't play well. The Americans have never really taken to him. Even Biden, apparently, used to argue and quarrel with him. I remember when Zelensky in 2022 visited Congress. This is at the time when the Battle of Bakhmut was beginning. Again, I remember that there was offense taken at the way that he was dressed, his camouflage jacket and all of that. And there was a sense on the part of some people, not everybody obviously in the United States, but on the part of some people, that he came across as ungrateful and unappreciative of American help, and as arrogant and as entitled. And this repeated itself all over again when he visited the United States in September, when Initially, he was not intending to meet Donald Trump. A meeting was eventually hastily arranged. And of course, Zelensky's next meeting with Trump and Vance in the Oval Office in February, as we all know, was a complete disaster. Europeans have never understood this. I remember another occasion when Zelensky gate-crashed a meeting of the Arab League, insisted on talking to Ukraine. I remember seeing the row of faces of the Arab delegates there, all of them stony-faced, some of them looking angry, and MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, looking absolutely furious. As I said, it's not something that Europeans appear at all to understand, that outside of Europe, Zelensky just doesn't wear very well. Anyway, so much for all this. We're going to have lots of people turning up in Moscow on the 9th of May. Putin is going to be hosting various leaders, and, well, we will see whether by that point steps have been taken to get the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians back on track. There are rumors, there are claims that despite the fact that the talks at the moment appear to be, well, not so much deadlocked as in abeyance. As I said, I'm not aware of any discussions currently between the Americans and the Russians on any subject at all. Just saying. There are rumors, nonetheless, that the Americans and the Russians are discussing possible joint economic projects. The Russian ambassador, the new Russian ambassador, is apparently now in the United States. He will no doubt present his credentials to Trump, and presumably he will be in contact with the officials of the State Department before long. I don't know about any American ambassador being sent to Moscow, however. But anyway, perhaps out of these arrangements, we will start to see at some point moving forward some signs that some kind of dialogue between the Americans and the Russians continues to be underway. But for the moment, things on the diplomatic front look frozen, and the focus instead is on the war. Everybody is waiting to see what the Russians do. They clearly hold the initiative. Maybe they will advance and launch their big attack in May. That remains to be seen. Anyway, in the meantime, I should say that I've also received from a source more information about the Oreshnik and the production numbers thereof. Now, again, I'm not going to discuss the production numbers in detail I'm not going to give any particulars, because, again, I worry that if I do that, I may be disclosing things about the source which I do not want to do. All I will say is that the production numbers which have been spoken about up to now, which is 20 Oreshnik missiles a month, look like they're going to be very significantly exceeded in the near future. Just saying. This is just the first pilot batch of Oreshniks. There will probably be several hundred of them available for use by the Russians by midsummer to support their offensive, just saying. But beyond that, we are talking about many more of these missiles being produced, and I've been provided with a great deal of information about this. And it looks as if, as I had suspected, the Russians are working on a shipborne version as well. Putin, when he went to Murmansk, also spoke about how the Russians were preparing to carry out significant updates to their fleet. There's been many rumors for some time that the Russians are planning new projects for missile launching submarines and missile launching cruisers. It looks as if those plans are indeed underway, and that the Oreshnik is, or at least an Oreshnik, a version of the Oreshnik, adapted for naval purposes, is indeed in the course of being prepared and is at the centre of many of these plans. I should also say that I've also received quite a lot of information about the guidance system of the Oreshnik's warheads. Again, there's been much discussion about whether they can indeed be guided, given that they are operating at hypersonic speeds. The answer is perhaps yes, but I'm not going to say more. I've also received information about drone production and artillery use on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Russians are now saying that it is indeed the case that the largest number of casualties they get are from Ukrainian drones, not from Ukrainian artillery. I suspect that the reason for that is that Ukraine's artillery arsenal has now become very severely depleted again. In terms of drones, despite the fact that, as I said earlier, around 80% of the film I see of FPV drones attacking targets is of Ukrainian FPV drones attacking Russian targets, because it's the Ukrainians who tend to publish most of this film. In fact, and in reality, the Russians have massively surpassed Ukraine in production of FPV drones. I'm told that whilst Ukraine produces around 1 million FPV drones a year, and that apparently is its maximum capacity, it's reached its maximum capacity, Russia produces around 5 million a year. On an average day, the Russians launch around 15,000 FPV drones, as opposed to the Ukrainians, who launch between 3,500 and 5,000 FPV drones a day. And apparently, increasingly, it's closer to the 3,500 as opposed to the 5,000. So the Russians outgun Ukraine massively. They have far more artillery firepower behind them. And of course they have dominance in the air, and they have the larger drones, the Predator-type drones that they've been deploying in increasing numbers, the Orion-type drones and things like that. But the Russians are also starting to swamp the Ukrainians in terms of drones. And recently, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, Medvedev, he's also the head of the Russian Military Industrial Commission. He visited a plant where they're apparently producing a specialized type of rifle which uses some kind of laser device which is apparently intended to knock out or destroy Ukrainian FPV drones. I'm not going to pretend that I understand very much about this technology. The Ukrainians apparently have also used it. But again, the likelihood is, if it works, and I don't know that it does, that we will be seeing a lot more of these things appearing. And again, the Russians, with their immensely greater industrial capacities, will be able to dwarf the drones will be able to dwarf whatever counters to the drones that the Ukrainians have. In every war, what one tends to see is that the pendulum swings. So if in 2024 FPV drones became increasingly important in the war, I suspect that in 2025 we will see that counters to these FPV drones will become increasingly common, and quite likely their effectiveness will reduce. I've also seen information about casualties, about the nature of casualties that these FPV drones cause, and as I somewhat guessed, in the great majority of cases, again because the explosive is light, and again because if a drone, an FPV drone, falls close to a soldier, because the explosive is limited, the explosive charge, the explosion will be limited as well, so that a soldier who takes cover might survive. Anyway, it seems that in most great majority of cases, the injuries are relatively light or very light, and that in the great majority of cases, Russians, soldiers who have been targeted by FPV drones and have had encounters with them, kinetic encounters with them, are able to return to the battle after relatively quick surgery or treatment. Anyway, there we go. So I think we're going to see a different type of war in 2025. I think, as I said, that the drones will become less effective. Both sides are now, by the way, deploying longer range FPV drones, 30 to 40 kilometer drones. There's pictures of Russian drones now flying regularly over Dnipro region. There was a report in TASS about the fact that the Ukrainians are deploying 40 kilometer drones with 40 kilometer ranges. But I expect, as I said, that we will see that the various countermeasures that have been developed to reduce the effectiveness of drones will start to have an impact, and I would not be surprised if we return to more mechanized and dynamic war. Anyway, there we go. That's what I'm going to discuss in today's program. We're looking forward to a big offensive. The Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian army, short of men and machines. The Russian army becoming stronger. Putin clearly very confident. The Russians very confident. The Oreshniks coming into service in midsummer. Be an interesting summer, and we will see what happens, and we will see what the President of the United States and his officials do, and we will see how the Europeans react to events, even as these increasingly turn against them. Anyway, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.